Dawn, on the 5th of September, 1944. A walled camp on the western edge of Athens, in the suburb of Haidari, the largest prison the German occupation kept on Greek soil. The guards came for a girl named Iro Konstantopoulou. She was 17 years old. She had been a courier for the resistance, carrying messages and forged papers through a city thick with checkpoints. And she had been caught, and she had been tortured, and now she was being walked to a wall to be shot. An older woman watched her go. Her name was Lela Karagianni. She was 46, a mother of 7, and she ran one of the most effective intelligence networks in occupied Greece. She had 3 days left to live. As the girl passed, the older woman is remembered to have said one thing to her. "Well done, my Iro. This is how Greek women die." Neither name appears in most of the histories the world reads about the Second World War. For nearly 40 years, neither name was honored by the Greek state either. The women who resisted the occupation of Greece, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, earned a place in one of the most stubborn resistance movements in occupied Europe, and then lived to watch their own country decide they had been something other than patriots. The ones who lived, that is. Many did not. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. To understand why those words at the wall carry the weight they do, you have to go back to the spring of 1941 and watch a country come apart in a matter of weeks. Fascist Italy had invaded from Albania in October 1940, and the Greek army had not only held the line, but driven the Italians back into the Albanian mountains, the first land defeat handed to the Axis anywhere in the war. Then, on the 6th of April, 1941, Germany came down from the north. The Greek forces fell back under the weight of the Wehrmacht, and inside of a few weeks the campaign was finished. King George II and his government left for Cairo, and then for London. The soldiers who had humiliated Mussolini were scattered or behind wire. What was left was an occupied country cut into 3 pieces. Germany took the ground that mattered most: Athens and Thessaloniki, much of Crete, the sea lanes of the Aegean. Italy administered most of the mainland. Bulgaria annexed the northeast outright and set about erasing its Greek character, outlawing the language, and deporting the educated by the thousand. On the last night of May 1941, 2 young men climbed the Acropolis in the dark and tore down the swastika the Germans had raised over the city. The act became a legend across occupied Europe. It also told the occupiers something they would spend 3 years failing to fix. The Greeks were not going to be quiet. Then came the hunger. The occupiers stripped the country of harvests, fuel, livestock, even fishing boats, and shipped the surplus north to the Reich. An Allied naval blockade closed the sea. The plains that grew the grain, in Thessaly and Macedonia and Thrace, lay behind zone borders the wrecked transport system could no longer cross. The price of bread in Athens multiplied roughly 89 times between April of 1941 and June of 1942, and money stopped meaning anything. In that first winter, the people of the capital began to die where they walked. The most careful modern study of the catastrophe, by the historian Violeta Hyanidou, puts the dead of the famine across the whole occupation at somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000. In Athens, the city ran short of the fuel it needed to carry the bodies, and turned to carts that went out before light. In August of 1942, Hermann Göring put the logic of it in writing to his commanders in the occupied lands, telling them plainly that he did not care if the people under their administration starved, so long as no German did. And over all of it hung the threat of reprisal. When the resistance struck, the occupation answered by killing civilians who had nothing to do with it, whole villages at a time, at Collaborators in the winter of 1943 and at Gestapo in the summer of 1944. To resist in Greece was to gamble not only your own life, but the lives of everyone in your street. There was a second catastrophe inside the first one, and it fell on the country's Jews. Greece held one of the oldest Jewish populations in Europe, more than 70,000 people, the largest community by far in Thessaloniki, where about 50,000 Jews made up something close to a fifth of the city. Beginning on the 15th of March, 1943, the Germans cleared that community out, loading roughly 48,000 people into cattle wagons at the old railway station and sending them to Auschwitz. Almost none came back. Of the Thessaloniki Jews, all but a fraction were murdered. Across the whole of Greece, more than 8 in 10 of the Jewish population were killed, one of the highest proportions anywhere on the continent. In the Bulgarian-held northeast, the same thing happened by other hands. In a single coordinated sweep in March of that year, the Bulgarian authorities seized the Jews of towns like Kavala and Drama, more than 4,000 people, and passed them to the Germans for deportation to Treblinka, where nearly all of them were murdered. The day the first train pulled out of Thessaloniki, the 15th of March, is kept in Greece now as a day of remembrance. The Archbishop of Athens, Damaskinos, sent the Germans a formal protest and then quietly ordered the Greek Church to issue false baptismal papers to any Jew who asked for one, and thousands of Jews fled from the German zone toward the comparative safety of the Italian areas. The Jewish population of Athens swelled as they came. Some of those who hid them, and some of those who fled, will come back into this story by name. There was no army to turn to. The government was abroad. No Allied soldier would set foot on the Greek mainland in force for another 3 years. The help that did come, from the British Special Operations Executive, amounted to a handful of officers, some gold sovereigns, and weapons dropped by parachute, valuable but thin against 3 occupying powers. The king himself was little comfort. Many Greeks had not forgotten that he had stood behind the Metaxas dictatorship, and his government in Cairo felt very far away from a city where people were eating grass. For all practical purposes, the people of Greece were on their own, and the thing that rose to fight in place of the vanished state grew out of the population itself. In September of 1941, a coalition of left-wing parties, with the Communist Party of Greece at its center, founded the National Liberation Front, known by its Greek initials as EAM. Its armed wing, the Greek People's Liberation Army, or ELAS, swelled from nothing into a force of perhaps 17,000 fighters in the field by the May of 1943 and close to 30,000 by that July, holding much of the interior. In November of 1942, resistance teams working alongside British sappers blew the Gorgopotamos viaduct and cut the rail line, carrying supplies toward Rommel's armies, the proof that the Greeks could reach something that mattered to the whole war. The Gestapo came to file the Greeks among the most rebellious people they policed anywhere. And the membership that made all of it possible was, to a degree the post-war world would work hard to bury, female. The figures are not small or vague. EAM's welfare arm, National Solidarity, counted around 3 million members, and close to 1.75 million of them were women. In the youth front, EPON, girls and young women made up nearly half the roles. This was a country where women had no vote. In the villages, many had been raised in homes where a girl did not so much as speak to an unrelated man. The dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas, which had run Greece from 1936 until the invasion, had jailed the communists and shut down political life entirely. For a Greek woman to walk into the resistance was to walk across nearly every boundary her society had drawn around her, and they did it in their hundreds of thousands. They ran the soup kitchens that kept the cities from emptying. In the Thessalian plains they helped run what the partisans called the War of the Crops, seeding fields in secret and harvesting them at night, so the grain went to the hungry and not to the occupiers. They sheltered fighters, smuggled medicine, printed and carried the underground press. The resistance reached the women it needed by speaking to them directly, in pamphlets with plain titles like The Girl and Her Demands and How Should Woman Work Within EM, telling the Greek girl that she was fighting to be free both of the foreign occupier and of the old superstitions of her own country. Most of that work never involved a weapon, and it counted all the same. National Solidarity was, in effect, the welfare arm of a country whose government had fled. Its women ran feeding stations for the starving, found homes for orphaned children, gathered food and clothing for families whose men had been shot or shipped to labor camps, and nursed the sick in cities where the hospitals had run dry. They sheltered men the occupiers were hunting, including British and Commonwealth soldiers stranded after the collapse, and moved them along the same hidden chains that carried the underground newspapers. In the mountains, women went with the fighters as nurses and quartermasters, hauling loads up tracks too steep for pack animals. Among them were Jewish women who had trained with the Greek Red Cross during the war against Italy, and then served the resistance in the very years their own families were being deported. And some of these women were known to the Allies all along. The files of the British Special Operations Executive, the service that ran agents in occupied Greece, record women on its payroll by name, women who carried its messages, hid its officers, and gathered the intelligence London wanted. The British knew exactly who they were while the war was being fought. That knowledge did not survive into the histories the British wrote once it was over. What those women actually did, once inside the resistance, is something historians still argue about, and the honest answer is that the record is divided. The standard scholarly account by Tolovervinioti found that women were the backbone of the auxiliary services of ELAS, as nurses, couriers, cooks, runners, and organizers, but were mostly kept out of the fighting units themselves. Other sources, including the resistance press of the time, describe women under arms. News had reached Greece of the women fighting in Yugoslavia and Albania. A Greek partisan newspaper carried an account of a Yugoslav fighter who told visiting Greeks that a quarter of Tito's partisans were women, and the writer admitted they had been stunned to hear it. In May of 1943, the poet Sophia Mavroidi Papadakis dedicated verses to the young women warriors. That same spring, the EM women's paper, Women's Action, printed an appeal urging women in the villages to form fighting sections from those young enough and willing enough to carry a rifle. Some answered it. A few of their names survive in the partisan press and in memoirs written long after, most of them recorded only by a first name or a fighting name, women who appear for a line or two and then drop out of the record entirely. The true extent of their combat is one of the things the record refuses to settle, partly because so much of it was never written down, and partly because of what was done to the memory of the whole movement once the war was over. What does survive, and survives in detail, are individual women, named, whose actions no quarrel about doctrine can wave away. Begin with Electra Apostolou. She was born in 1912, in a suburb north of Athens, into a comfortable middle-class family, and she was sent to a German-language school in the city, an education that would sit in bitter contrast with the men who later interrogated her. At 13, she joined the Communist Youth League, a decision that appalled her parents. Under the Metaxas dictatorship, she was arrested and sentenced to 2 years for handing out forbidden literature. She married a doctor, briefly, and had a daughter named Agni. By the time the Germans arrived, she had already spent most of her adult life as a woman the authorities watched, and the occupation did not slow her down. Between the summer of 1942 and early 1943, she led an organization of young anti-fascists who called themselves the New Freedom, and one of her tasks was the grim, practical work of judging which members were likely to break under torture and which were not. In 1943, she was among the founders of EPON, the youth organization that would pull in a generation of Greeks, hundreds of thousands of them, into reading circles and relief work, and, when a moment demanded it, the underground and the firing line. She worked above all with young women, through a paper called Free Young Woman, around a conviction she had carried since girlhood, that women would only ever be free if they fought in the open to be free. In the spring of 1944 it ended. She was taken, and the men who took her were not Germans but Greeks, the state special security directorate, the collaborationist police that Athenians called the Greek Gestapo, without irony. They tortured her over days. The forensic examination carried out after her death recorded the marks of it on her body. She told them nothing of value. A fragment of her interrogation came down through the years precisely because the men in the room could not break it, and it reads less like a statement than a wall. Asked where she came from, she answered Greece. Asked where she lived, Greece. Asked her name, she answered Greek. Asked to give up her collaborators, she said they were all Greeks. On the 26th of July, 1944, when it was clear she would never be of use to them, they shot her. Her brother Lefteris, himself a senior figure in EM, lived through the war and named his own daughter Electra after her. She was, in the language the resistance used about itself, an organizer, and the organizers were in some ways the most dangerous people the occupation faced, because what they built outlasted them. The networks Apostolou helped knit together did not die on the 26th of July. They were still running messages and hiding fugitives when the city was freed. The woman who would speak to Iro Konstantopoulou at the wall came to the same work by an entirely different door. Lela Karagianni was born Eleni Minopoula in 1898 on the island of Euboea, and she counted Laskarina Bubalina, the naval commander of the Greek War of Independence a century before, among her ancestors. By the time of the occupation, she was a housewife in Athens, the wife of a pharmacist, the mother of 7 children. There is nothing in a life like that which points toward a firing squad. In October of 1941, she built a resistance cell anyway, and named it Bulgaria, for the ancestor whose name she carried, and she ran it from the back rooms of her husband's pharmacy. It grew to roughly 100 members, several of them her own children. They forged identity papers and travel documents. They moved stranded Allied soldiers, men cut off when the front collapsed, out of the German zone and down toward Egypt, sometimes routed through a monastery at Megara, then handed to the coast and put aboard the small wooden kayaks of the Aegean for the long passage to British hands. They fed starving children. They carried intelligence to the British. And they hid Jews from the deportations that were emptying the country's ancient communities, work that ran alongside the false papers the Athens church was issuing. And that is the reason the state of Israel would one day name Lela Karagianni among the righteous among the nations, the honor it reserves for those who risked everything to save Jewish lives. Athenians who knew of her called her the Bubalina of the occupation. She had been warned, when the arrests began in the summer of 1944, to disappear. She refused. In July, the Germans took her, and 5 of her children with her. She was brought to the security headquarters on Merlin Street, a building Greek prisoners knew as the House of Hell, and she was tortured there for days. She did not give up her people. They moved her to Haidari, and even inside the camp she went on coordinating what she could. On the 8th of September, 1944, 34 days before the Germans abandoned Athens, she was shot alongside more than 70 other prisoners. By several accounts, she went to the wall singing. She was 46 years old. Her house in Athens still stands, and the street it sits on now carries her name, and a bust of her stands near Omonia Square in the center of the city. That detail matters later, which carries the account back to the girl whose death opens it. Iro Konstantopoulou was born in Athens in 1927, into a well-off family, and she was 13 when the occupation began. She joined EPON and became a courier, which was the most dangerous ordinary task in the whole resistance, because a courier carried the very thing that could convict her on her own body, through a city where a single search at a single checkpoint ended in a cell. She was caught and held at Haidari, and on the 5th of September, 1944, 37 days before the Germans left the city, she was let out with 49 others and shot. She was 17. According to several accounts that came out of the camp, her body was struck 17 times, 1 round for each year she had lived, and left that way deliberately, a warning to anyone who still imagined a teenage girl could not be a soldier. It was as the guards walked her out that morning that Lela Karagianni said the words she is remembered by. 3 days later, the older woman walked the same road to the same ground. The 3 of them died within the same few weeks, in the same wave of killing that ran through Athens in the last summer of the occupation, as the Germans and their Greek auxiliaries emptied the cells ahead of the retreat. Haidari sat at the center of it. Thousands of prisoners passed through the camp on the city's western edge across its 2 years, and something close to 2,000 of them were shot, many in the ravine at Daphne, along the old sacred way that pilgrims had once walked toward Eleusis. The executions of early September 1944, the ones that took Iro Konstantopoulou, and then Lela Karagianni 3 days behind her, were among the last and the largest. The names that survive are the names someone wrote down, or carried in memory, or carved later into stone. For every Apostolou and Karagianni and Konstantopoulou, there were others whose only record is a line in a German register or an unexplained gap in a family. A girl who carried one message too many, a woman shot in reprisal for what a husband or a son had done, names that went into the ground with the bodies. The resistance these women built was a mass movement, and a mass movement does not leave 3 martyrs. It leaves thousands, and then it loses most of their names. Everything in the accounts so far happened in the cities, in the dark, in the work of couriers and forgers and spies, the kind of resistance that hides in plain sight and dies in basements and camps. But the title over this story promises women who fought, and there were women who fought in the open, in the mountains, with weapons in their hands. Their story is harder to document, because the mountains kept fewer records than the city did, and because the movement they fought for would spend the post-war decades being written out of the national account. One of them, though, left enough of a trail to follow, and her life runs straight through the middle of everything this story is about. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is far more in the record still to cover, and your support is what keeps these stories coming. Her name was Sarah, born Sarika Yehoshua, in 1927, in the old Jewish quarter of Chalkida, the town across the narrow strait on the island of Euboea. Her father died when she was an infant, and she was raised by her mother and an older sister on the main street of the quarter. The family thought of themselves as Greek through and through, and kept the Sabbath candles on Friday nights. By several accounts, her mother was a sister of Colonel Mordecai Phryzis, the Greek officer who had fallen leading his men against the Italians in the Albanian mountains in December of 1940, among the first senior Greek commanders killed in the war, and a name whose memory shaped the girl's sense of what she owed her country. Before she was 15, she had volunteered as a nurse at the Chalkida Military Hospital. When the deportations of Greece's Jews began, and word reached her of whole communities taken away and never seen again, she got false papers for herself and her mother and left the town for the mountain villages of the interior. The resistance scattered the Jews who had fled into the hills among a string of villages, places called Stropones and Theologos and Vasiliko, and later ran an escape line by boat across to neutral Turkey. Sarah joined EM and quickly made herself known as a speaker who argued, hard and in public, for taking up arms, and who argued it especially to other young women. Then, in early 1944, collaborationist gunmen of the security battalions murdered her cousin in the village of Stropones and burned a neighboring village to the ground. Whatever hesitation she had left went with them. She did something no one around her had seen a woman do. She went from village to village recruiting other young women, girls raised in homes where they had never spoken to a man, and she came back with more than a dozen of them, and she set about turning them into soldiers. She was learning the work herself as she taught it to them. Every day, she would say long afterward, she was taught something new and then taught it to them. On their first operation, they were handed Molotov cocktails and sent to draw the enemy's fire and attention so the men could strike from another direction. They proved good at it. They went on to burn the houses of collaborators, to gather intelligence, and to help hunt down informers, including, by her own account, the man whose betrayal had cost her cousin's life, whom she tracked and killed. Her group did more than fight. They moved through the villages gathering word of German movements, and they staged plays for the people they passed, the same pairing of the rifle and the stage that other resistance women would reach for later, in far worse places. The male fighters around her, impressed almost against their will, brought the women into more and more of their operations. And here the pattern that runs under this entire story shows itself plainly. The missions those women carried out were, again and again, credited to the men, because the people telling the story afterward could not make themselves believe that women had done such things. Sarah was an exception only because she became too visible to her race. By the age of 18, the partisans of Euboea did not call her by her name. They called her Captainessa Sarika, Captain Sarika, and when anything needed doing, the saying went that you told Captain Sarika, and Captain Sarika would see to it. An American correspondent who passed through occupied Euboea gave her a paragraph in a dispatch on the Greek partisans, describing a short, sturdy young woman with dark hair and blue eyes who could run like a man and could shoot a walnut off a branch at 200 yards, and who led her company down the mountain track singing, beating out the marching time with her arm. By the time the country was free, she was the recognized commander of a women's platoon attached to the 7th Regiment of ELAS on Euboea, a unit some accounts call the Model Women's Platoon. Sarah lived. That fact, set beside Apostolou and Karagianni and Konstantopoulou, lands differently than it would on its own, because what happened to her after the liberation is its own kind of verdict on everything these women had done. To see why women became so central to the Greek resistance, and why the occupation found them so hard to stop, look at the thing the enemy got wrong. A German checkpoint, a collaborationist policeman, a paid informer, all of them carried the same assumption in their heads that Greek society carried, that a woman with a basket was a woman with a basket. She was a wife, a daughter, a girl running an errand. She was not a threat. That assumption was a door, and the resistance walked through it by the thousand. Women carried messages folded into their clothes, weapons under the shopping, leaflets beneath an infant held in their arms, through searches that a man would never have survived. The contempt that kept them out of the history books afterward was the same contempt that let them operate while the war was on. The occupation could not see them, which is exactly why they worked. The skill had its limits and its price. The same young women who slipped through the checkpoints by the dozen also filled the cells at Merlin Street and the wall at Haidari when the price came due. EAM understood the advantage and built on it on purpose. It published a women's newspaper. It told women, in print, that their place was in the struggle, and it offered them something their own families and their own state never had, a movement in which a woman could rise, could organize, could command, and could be addressed by a rank instead of a name. The historians who have studied the resistance women note that inside EAM and ELAS, there was more equality between men and women than in the Greek family or Greek society of the time, that the movement openly preached the freeing of women from the old patriarchal bonds, and that this was not a side effect, but a source of its enormous reach. It pulled in women who had nothing else offering them a place in the public world, and those women in turn pulled in their families. The villagers, one careful account records, supported that message reluctantly while the war was on and rejected it quickly once the war was over. How far EM was willing to take it became plain in the spring of 1944 in the mountains, where the resistance had cleared the occupiers out of so much territory that it governed it. On the 10th of March, 1944, EM set up a government of its own, the Political Committee of National Liberation, to administer what people were calling Free Greece, a stretch of the mountainous mainland that covered roughly half the country's land and held something like 2.5 million people. In late April, it held elections to a parliament, the National Council, across both the liberated zone and the occupied cities, including Athens. Somewhere between 1.5 and 1.75 million people voted. These were the first elections in the whole of Greek history in which women were allowed to cast a ballot and to stand as candidates. And when the council met that May in a mountain village of Coruscades, with roughly 200 members, 5 of them were women. The same government made the everyday, demotic Greek of ordinary people the official language of Free Greece, in place of the formal tongue of the school books and the courts. For a few months, in the poorest and most cut-off corner of an occupied country, women who could not vote anywhere else on earth in Greece were electing a parliament and sitting in it. Hold that fact, because the country was about to take it back. It is worth being exact about who was hunting these women, because the easy version of this story is wrong. A great deal of the killing was not done by Germans at all. The State Special Security Directorate that tortured Electra Apostolou was Greek. The security battalions that murdered Sarah's cousin were Greek, armed, and paid by the occupation to fight the resistance. By 1944, the collaborationist government in Athens, under Ioannis Rallis, had built those battalions into a force tens of thousands strong. Greeks in German-supplied uniforms who spent their war fighting their own neighbors in EM rather than any foreign enemy. The men in the interrogation rooms on Merlin Street served the Germans, but many of them spoke the same language as the women they were breaking and came from the same streets. The occupation of Greece, like every occupation, ran on collaborators, and the women of the resistance were as often betrayed and broken by their own countrymen as by the foreign army. That fact would poison everything that came after, because when the war ended, the collaborators and the people who had fought them did not simply go their separate ways. What happened to the women themselves divides along a single hard line, the line between those the occupation caught and those it did not. Apostolou was tortured and shot in July. Karagianni was tortured and shot in September. Konstantopoulou was shot at 17 in the same week as Karagianni. They are 3 names out of roll that runs far longer, most of it unrecorded, women whose only monument is a line in a camp register or a date carved beside a village church. The ones the occupation never caught, the couriers who were not searched at the wrong moment, the fighters in the hills like Sarah, lived to see the country freed in October 1944, and many of them believed, in that first autumn, that they had won something, not only a free country, but a new place inside it for women like them. In the mountains, the same village men who had fought beside them, and the same villages that had only reluctantly accepted a woman with a rifle were already easing the women back toward the lives they had left, and the new authorities in Athens looked at a woman who had carried a gun for EM and saw not a veteran, but a problem to be managed. They were about to learn otherwise. The Germans pulled out of Athens in October of 1944. Within weeks, the alliance that had fought them began to come apart. The resistance was led by the communist EM, and Britain, which had backed the exiled king and meant to restore him, was not prepared to let a communist-led movement inherit the country it had liberated. Tension over the disarming of ELAS broke into the open. On the 3rd of December, 1944, an EM demonstration in the center of Athens was fired on, and within hours British troops and the returning government forces were fighting the same ELAS fighters who had spent 3 years tying down the Germans. Winston Churchill ordered the British commander on the spot to hold the capital and to treat the EM and ELAS forces approaching it as an enemy to be neutralized or destroyed. British soldiers who had been told they were coming to a friendly, liberated country found themselves in the streets of Athens that December, fighting the only force that had seriously resisted the Germans for the previous 3 years. The fighting that followed, which Greeks call the Decembriana, the events of December, broke the wartime resistance as a political force and opened the road to a civil war. That civil war, fought between 1946 and 1949, between the Western-backed Greek state and the communists, decided whose version of the recent past would become the official one. The state won, and the state had no interest in honoring a resistance led by the people it had just defeated. A terror swept the country in which former collaborators kept their posts in the army and the police, while former partisans were hunted, jailed, and in many cases executed a second time, now as enemies of the state rather than of the occupation. The women did not escape it. Tens of thousands of Greek women who had been in the resistance refused to recant what they had done, and many of them spent a decade, some of them 2 decades, in mainland prisons and in the island camps the post-war state built for its political prisoners. For the women who stayed, the reckoning came slower and lasted longer. Its instrument was a single sheet of paper the authorities called a Declaration of Repentance. To sign it was to renounce the left and the resistance and walk free. To refuse was to be marked an enemy of the nation and sent away. Thousands of women refused. They were held first in mainland prisons and then shipped out to a chain of island camps, Chios and Trikeri, and the bare rock of Makronesos and Ai Stratus, places the government called centers of national rehabilitation, and the women who lived through them called something nearer to hell. Trikeri had been a men's camp until 1947, when it was turned over to women taken in the Civil War. They came ashore, many of them holding babies, onto a green and beautiful island and into a camp with almost nothing in it, sleeping on the ground, short of food, with no care for the children and beatings for those who would not sign. By the autumn of 1949, there were something like 4,700 prisoners on Trikeri alone. The government that held them denied, in public, that Greece had any political prisoners at all. And behind the wire the women did what they had done in the resistance. They organized. They shared out the raising of the children, nursed one another, taught the ones who could not read. And on an island where nearly everything was forbidden, they put on the old tragedies, staging Antigone, the play about a woman who buries her brother against the order of the state and is sealed in a cave alive for it. The last of those camps did not close until the early 1950s. The vote those mountain women had cast in 1944 was undone with everything else. Greek women would not be granted the vote in a national election until 1952, 8 years after they had elected a parliament in the hills, and the first woman would not take a seat in the Athens parliament until the year after that. The fight for that vote was old by then. A writer named Kalliroi Parent had founded the first Greek women's newspaper to argue for it back in the 1880s, and as late as 1930 the state had let only literate women over the age of 30 vote in local elections, a concession the newspapers of the day still treated as a danger. Set against that, what the women of free Greece had done in the spring of 1944, electing a parliament and sitting in it, looks less like a wartime curiosity than like the thing their own country would spend another generation refusing to permit. Sarah Fortis was arrested. She was released only because her reputation as a hero of the fight against the Germans was too large to ignore, and she left Greece for Israel, where she settled in Tel Aviv and, decades later, in 2004, sat down in front of a camera and recorded her testimony, so that what she and her village girls had done would not vanish with her. Then the record itself was rewritten in law. The first post-war statute on recognizing the national resistance, passed in 1949 during the Civil War, and the second, passed in 1969 under the military dictatorship that had seized the country in 1967, both recognized only the so-called national resistance, meaning the right-wing and non-communist organizations. Both deliberately excluded EM and ELAS, the movement that had been by far the largest, and branded it instead anti-national and traitorous, a movement whose role in fighting the Germans, the laws implied, had only masked a plan to seize power. For nearly 40 years, in the official memory of the Greek state, the largest resistance to the occupation, the resistance that hundreds of thousands of women had built and bled for, was not a glory but a crime. It was only in 1982, after 3 days of debate in the Greek parliament that August, that a new law finally recognized the EM and ELAS resistance as part of the national resistance, and gave the women who had fought it the standing they had been denied since the war ended. By then a great many of them were dead. Some had been dead for 38 years. Years later, when Greeks were polled about it, more than 8 in 10 would name that recognition one of the most important and positive things their republic had done. What that long silence cost is hard to measure, because it was measured in things that did not happen. It was the pensions that were never paid, the names that were never read out at the memorials, the school textbooks in which the largest resistance in the country's history, and the women who had filled its ranks, simply did not appear. For decades, the only people keeping the account were the women themselves and their families. In memoirs printed by small left-wing houses, in the journal some of them had written on the prison islands and smuggled out, in the stories told at kitchen tables that did not match the story taught in the schools. When the recognition came in 1982, it came with the awkwardness of any apology that arrives 40 years late. There were quarrels over who qualified and charges that the process had been abused. But it ended the official lie. The state that had called these women traitors now called them what they had been. For the ones still alive to see it, some of them by then old women who had given their youth to the mountains and a decade of their lives to the camps, it was the first time their country had agreed with them about the most important thing they had ever done. The claim in the title over this story is narrower and harder than it first sounds. It is not that no document anywhere records these women. Plenty do. It is that the two powers who decided how the war in Greece would be remembered, the Western allies who came back to fight the resistance, and then shaped the Western account of it, and the Greek state that criminalized that resistance for 2 generations, had little room in their histories for a communist-led movement, and less still for its women. The Cold War had no use for them. Their own government treated their courage as treason for as long as most of them lived. They were written out not by oversight, but by the politics of the people who won the peace, and they fought, very largely, alone, against 3 occupiers, with their own state in exile, and their eventual liberators not yet come. What remains, if you know to look for it, is scattered across 2 countries. In Athens, there is a street called Lela Karagianni, and on it stands the house where Lela Karagianni ran the Bubalina network out of the back of her husband's pharmacy. In 1995, it was declared a protected historical monument, and it is kept now as a museum to her and to the people who worked beside her. Her name is inscribed at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, on the wall of the righteous among the nations, for the Jews her network hid. The camp at Haidari, where she and Iro Konstantopoulou were shot in the same week of September 1944, still stands on the western edge of the city, its walls intact, a place a person can walk up to and look at. Electra Apostola's name is on memorials and on streets, fought over for decades between a left that claimed her and a right that called her a traitor, and now, at last, simply remembered. And in an archive in Israel, there is an old woman on film, Captain Sarika, telling the story of the village girl she turned into soldiers, because she understood that if she did not tell it, no one else would. She was not the only one. In Greece, the survivors of the island camps became keepers of the history too, sitting for documentary films in their old age, lending their prison journals to historians, seeing to it that the names were finally written down. The women who had built the resistance welfare networks rebuilt them after the war as open women's associations. And the thing they pressed for hardest, once the shooting had stopped, was a plain one: that the country care for its mothers and its children and never return to the years that had taken so many of both. Go back to the wall at Haidari on the morning of the 5th of September, 1944. A 17-year-old girl is being walked to her death by men who would shoot her body 17 times to make a point of it. An older woman with 3 days left of her own life watches her go and tells her, "Well done. This is how Greek women die." For 40 years their country could not bring itself to say what they had been. The record, when you gather it back together, says it plainly enough. They were soldiers of a war their own side would have preferred to forget, and they fought it to the end. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.